GWP News Weekly. I'm your host, Isaac Hedges, joined once again by co host Jacob Fulmer. In our top stories tonight, we'll be looking a little bit at some recent strikes on Iran, food pyramid flip, New York City nurses strike, all that and much more coming your way here on GWP News Weekly. So, Jake, it's my understanding that recently we've seen some more strikes on the part of our country, on the part of the United States, strikes on Iran. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so of course there is the potential that we could be dealing with strikes on Iran. Of course, that hasn't actually necessarily happened yet. That's more of a possibility as we go forward in time and a concern from the public there. So
Yes, the
we haven't actually
possibility of it.
had,
Yes, forgive me for my
yes.
misspeaking on that.
Yeah, no trouble with that. So we've had protesters, of course, that or protests have started to erupt in Iran and outside of Iran, and so that has sparked the concern. We're dealing with 490 protesters have actually been verified that dead. 48 security personnel are also within that group, and more than 10,600 people have been arrested within the past couple of weeks. And so this is so there's now some unrest in Iran leading to concerns that it could potentially get worse in the weeks to come.
Absolutely, and this is quite devastating to hear because, of course, it wasn't long ago here on GWP News, Jake, that we covered. It seems like things had finally settled down a bit in the Middle East, and now this. Of course, we know Iran certainly has had a role in recent conflicts, necessarily directly. Of course, the conflict, as we know it, was between Israel and Hamas, but of course, Hamas is widely regarded as an Iran proxy, and certain terrorist groups in that area are associated with that. So things of this deaths on this scale, sadly, isn't all that surprising for this area.
Yeah, and as far as those numbers that we gave from Reuters, that could very well be not 100% accurate. And so that's something that we have to consider as well because the reporting may not be accurate as well. So keep that in mind when it comes to that, just because of the difficulty with getting in and out of the country. And so Trump has also said to meet on Tuesday. So we'll have to see if there's any new developments on that as we go throughout this week, potentially as soon as again tomorrow.
Absolutely, and the latest numbers on death tolls there, just the latest estimates there from Reuters. So, again, we'll continue to follow that as that is a developing story, but naturally, a very dangerous area at that time, so it's fairly limited on what reporting can be done directly in that area. Jake?
Yes, and so of course there are different military options, and so the US could definitely get involved, but Iran has made a warning, knowing that that is a possibility, and Iran has warned that US troops and Israel would become targets if the US were to be attacked. So Iran issuing these warnings, probably trying to really, I guess you could say, scare the US military into not striking, but as we've seen recently in Venezuela, the US does not easily scare.
Right, right, and doesn't take too kindly, mind you, to these sort of threats, this sort of tough talk, and that is exactly what this sounds like. Tough talk, Jake, as you mentioned, not unlike we saw in the past week from President Maduro, and we know what happened with him. So, in many cases, it doesn't seem to be a great strategy, sort of that tough talk on the part of these other countries threatening the United States. Again, a top world power, as many would say, the global hegemon. So we'll have to stay tuned and see what happens there.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say on that news story is the fact that we have to remember that this also comes after just this past year, this past summer in June of 2025, we had Operation Midnight Hammer. And so that should remind everyone here in the world that this is not necessarily a new thing, it's just new developments and an ongoing story that we've been following.
Right, certainly just recent developments on a very much a long running, ongoing story, as you mentioned. I believe that does cover the extent of the information on the situation right now in the Middle East. Again, very devastating to hear about all the recent deaths, death tolls. Of course, those are estimates, but we'll get hopefully some more up to date information on that as the situation develops. You'll have to stay tuned for GWP news for that. So, in other recent events, Jake, coming back to the domestic front here on a national level, it's my understanding that our Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., has put out something new, something that does look somewhat familiar, though. Slightly different, but again, quite familiar. Has it been flipped over or something, or what exactly is going on here, Jake?
Well, what you may be referring to is the new food pyramid, which a lot of people can see. If you want to go and look that up on the internet, you can certainly do a Google search and you may see the new food pyramid here. We're actually looking at it right now. Those of you listening or watching are not able to currently see that at this moment in time. But if you do find it, then what you'll be able to see is that something is a little bit different about it. It's flipped upside down to the point where protein is now towards the top. Protein, vegetables, fruits are towards the top, and grains, whole grains in particular, are now towards the bottom.
Absolutely. And of course, in terms of dietary recommendations, different things like that in the United States, we've seen a number of recent changes. Jake, of course, you'll recall, many people out there our age will recall, of course, we had a required health class when we were in school. And at the time, what was used was sort of the my plate arrangement, which was a bit different. And of course, before that, we had the food pyramid. And what we have now is an inversion of that initial food pyramid, where initially those breads and starches were at the bottom, and the proteins and those healthy fats, those different things, were towards the top. We've seen an inversion of that now. And naturally, Jake, I'm not sure what your experience has been with things like this on my front. Certainly with my family, I can't say we necessarily adhered to the My Plate, the food pyramid. Any of those all that closely could be helpful for certain guidance, but more or less we have an idea of what is healthy. That's not necessarily something that we're looking to the government for in the first place. But in terms of on the long term and these changes, that seems to be the case. It's certainly been at least the impression been under for some time. Again, that proteins and healthy fats are important, and is not so much the case with the starches and different things. So it would seem that the recent change is appropriate, although again, not to say that look a great deal to the government for advice on dietary guidelines and different things like that. But nonetheless, this is interesting to see. Jake?
Yeah, and I think if we were to compare it to the old food pyramid, you would see that bread, cereal, rice, and the pasta group was kind of put on the bottom or most important with 6 to 11 servings. Then it was the vegetable group, 3 to 5 servings, fruits, 2 to 4 servings, meat, poultry, fish, dry beans, eggs, nuts, 2 to 3, milk, yogurt, and cheese group, 2 to 3 servings as well. And then it also said fats, oils, and sweets used sparingly. So that was the old food pyramid used back in the 90s when it was first introduced. Then, of course, as you mentioned, then the My Plate came around in the early 21st century. And then now, of course, here in 2026, we've seen that new food pyramid released. And so I think the really big question is whether or not people will follow it, because as you mentioned, I have to agree. I can't necessarily say that I've been actively trying to follow the food pyramid or My Plate maybe as much as I should have been. But I will say that it is certainly possible that with this new food pyramid that maybe people will adapt to that change and start to follow it a little bit more. Wouldn't you say
Right.
that's a
Right,
possibility?
it is possible, and of course, it's interesting that you mentioned that progression there. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, when we were in school, people our age, Jake, of course, the My Plate model was used, and even then, it was widely regarded that the food pyramid that predated it was defunct. It wasn't um, all that great in terms of the way it advised you on different dietary guidelines and different things like that. So I'd say it's probably due for an update. And again, a number of interesting initiatives there with the Department of Health and Human Services there, headed by RFK Jr. Another interesting note and something we may cover later. Of course, we've covered AI extensively, certainly on the Great World podcast, even on GWP News. But recently, RFK has recommended different wearable electronics that are supposed to help with your health, things like Fitbits, Aura Rings, all of these different fitness watches, and things like that. And then another new company, particularly with AI, that's looking to get into that is OpenAI with ChatGPT Health. Again, very interesting. The way it looks is that you'd have to turn over your medical records to ChatGPT. So it sounds a bit fishy, but there certainly seems to be a market for it, certainly in light of RFK's recent remarks on that topic. But I believe that covers things on the food pyramid and its recent flip. It's recently changed, of course. So moving on, Jake, other major events on a national level. I believe there was a major strike with union, some of the nurses in New York City. What do we know about that?
Yeah, so we go into that next topic here. So we did have some major hospitals around the Mount Sinai area into the New York City area where there was 15,000 nurses who went on strike. It began this morning, Monday, January 12th, 2026. Of course, the union that went on strike was hoping for some progress to be made when it came to safe staffing ratios, better benefits, and also protection from workplace violence. And also, they were hoping for some higher wages as well. So, those were some of the changes that New York City nurses were hoping to see. And that is part of the reason why they went on strike. Something else that is also worth noting is that the New York state law generally prohibits strikes by public employees. So just kind of an interesting set of events that's taken place here.
Absolutely, that is interesting, Jake. As you mentioned, something generally prohibited by New York state law, strike by public employees. Certainly, in this case, probably many of them are at these hospitals. And of course, this was a strike by the labor union there in New York, the New York State Nurses Association. So, for those who aren't familiar out there, perhaps with the idea of labor unions, these, of course, came about during the Industrial Revolution and certainly not without reason. Of course, many of the factories at that time had some pretty dangerous working conditions. There were all sorts of injuries on occasion, even deaths that happened in these factories. Oftentimes, the wages weren't all that great. It came from truly dire circumstances, and of course, that is why labor unions around that time were introduced. Now, that has since expanded to include even outside of labor in terms of that workforce in terms of manual labor. It actually includes different all kinds of things like nurses, there are teachers unions, and so there is certainly much of a discussion if there is a place for that in these other fields, certainly outside of industrial revolution era labor unions, and of course. It varies a great deal in terms of state law. We've had state laws recently, things with that in Missouri come into question. Certainly, and that is another thing worth noted. Of course, certainly those are all valid concerns, but we don't receive a great deal of detail. Generally, those are always the general reasons given for these sort of strikes is that their pay is too low or that their working conditions aren't great. But beyond that, we don't have a great deal of detail on that. And of course, on the other end of things, and just speaking broadly about business in New York. Many people, you speak to someone who does business in New York, they'll tell you that it's gotten more and more difficult recently in terms of the extensive regulations that they're required to comply with on terms of on the state level, different things like that. And naturally, of course, recent innovations, certainly in medical technologies, in this case, and of course, different economic conditions. Certainly, this is not to say that things cannot also be difficult on the other end, in this case, from the hospital's standpoint. So, again, important to note both sides of this whole event. Jake,
And something else that's kind of important to note here is that the strike is also happening during what has already been labeled by some as a severe flu season. And so the hospitals already have quite a major strain. I know that they certainly do here in Missouri, but I would say that it's most likely the same way in New York City. So this could certainly create problems for New York City residents who may catch the flu over the peak of the flu season.
Right, certainly is an issue, and certainly on the part of the New York State Nurses Association, the union here in question, it would seem that there is some answering to do on that front. Why now? I mean, certainly working conditions are important, wages are important, but again, the very profession in terms of actually being a nurse, in terms of actually showing up to work and assisting these patients, certainly, as is the role of their profession, is important. Nonetheless, of course, many would say that the wages are secondary to that. Of course, the goal of the profession. That's not that they aren't important, but again, this does happen during a major cold and flu season. So certainly, a recent influx of patients, even in that area. And naturally, as we know, of course, many employers, it is fairly standard, of course, outside of ordinary hours to get overtime pay, different things like that. So hopefully, the patients there, with a great deal of people here lately coming down with the flu, that in spite of these nurses going on strike, they're still able to get the treatment that they need. Jake?
Yeah, hopefully so. And we'll have to see how things change as we go through the remainder of the flu season. And I also have heard that COVID has also been on the rise. So that could also affect that as well.
Absolutely. And speaking of hospitals, we covered last week on GWP News Weekly a recent conflict between our hospital, Nevada Regional Medical Center, and the city of Joplin. Well, recently we've heard from the CEO of our hospital. He's put out a statement hoping to clarify some things on this conflict. And Jake, what have we heard from the CEO of our hospital here?
Yes, the Fort Scott Biz went ahead and posted that statement from the Nevada Regional Medical Center CEO, and we'll just read off part of that that kind of helps to inform us a little bit more of the other side of it here. Of course, we heard the city of Joplin's position. Now, this week we'll kind of look a little bit more at the Nevada Regional Medical Center's perspective, with the CEO saying this in quote. The city of Joplin has voiced public concerns singling out NRMC MC, Nevada Regional Medical Center, and has filed a lawsuit about patients discharged from the medical center who traveled to Joplin. Unfortunately, other than a threatening letter in the lawsuit, the city has made no attempt to talk about this issue, discover the actual facts of the discharges in question, or to resolve what the belief what they believe is the problem. It is unclear why the city of Joplin is pursuing legal action against another governmental entity in the state that also struggles to provide services to the homeless. Nevada Regional Medical Center empathetically denies all claims of inappropriate discharges from the hospital. The two patients who chose to travel to Joplin in 2025 following discharge is not a material contributor to the number of homeless in Joplin. So that kind of takes us into the other perspective of this lawsuit or just situation in general.
Certainly, yes. We covered initially in the past week more from the other end. Of course, initially going into this, sort of what sparked this, or sort of what brought this to our attention, is that letter threatening legal action from the city of Joplin to our hospital, the Nevada Regional Medical Center. Again, very strongly worded, threatening legal action, supposedly because our hospital dropped some homeless people off there at their homeless shelters without calling in advance for something or something, as if they didn't have the proper arrangements. And again, we didn't have a great deal of detail as far as how many there were, exactly what the issue was in terms of the accommodations. That is really just what we knew on that front. Again, that our hospital drop these homeless people off. And the interesting thing, of course, you brought this to my attention. I was already sort of under that impression, but of course, we do know now that the couple of people that our city had dropped off at homeless shelters in Joplin, they chose to go to those homeless shelters, and it wouldn't seem. I would see the objection from the city of Joplin certainly if this were just a huge group of people that they had dropped off, and it doesn't sound like that was the case. Sounds like we dropped off a few people there in Joplin. They had intentions of going there. And again, this is a very very recent change again in terms of law in the city of Joplin, in terms of making those arrangements, as we mentioned previously. And again, now we haven't heard a great deal, at least according to the CEO of our hospital. We haven't heard back from Joplin in recent times, so it's unclear if they intend to continue threatening legal action, if they actually intend to pursue that or not. But we haven't heard from them in a little while. Jake?
Yeah, and I guess some additional details to add to that. The first thing is that, of course, that ordinance that you were talking about, that city ordinance that talked about the homeless, trying to eliminate that homeless population there in Joplin, Missouri. Of course, that ordinance was back in November, so that's a recent change. And the other thing is that the city of Joplin, of course, was claiming that it was these two individuals in particular. It's important to note that those are not Nevada City residents. Those were just patients that were there at the regional medical center. Those two patients who were discharged were from Butler and the other one from the Kansas City area. Not clear on exactly where in Kansas City, but somewhere in the metro area. And so those were not city residents. So that's one kind of important thing to mention about this. The other thing is that the city of Joplin was waiting to hear back from the Nevada Regional Medical Center before making the decision of whether or not to pursue this lawsuit in the Jasper County Court. And so now that we've heard back from the CEO, we'll have to see what the city decides to do from there. But of course, the hospital is being sued for what appears to be something that they had been doing and that the city of Joplin had been coordinating, but a lot of things had changed because of that recent city ordinance, and that is what has caused the dispute, mainly the big change to that homeless policy there in the city.
Absolutely. Of course, interesting recent developments there. Some drama, including our local hospital, of course, with the city of Joplin there certainly. And of course, as we mentioned previously, just last week on GWP News Weekly, many cities, of course, struggle with this problem of homelessness. Again, many different causes it has been attributed to, of course, different economic issues. Again, drug use seems to be common with that. Again, a common cause, or certainly common with the homeless population there. But again, that's not necessarily a difference. Of course, there are more. Joplin is a bigger city than Nevada is, so nationally, they probably already have more homeless people there. And the other thing is, being a bit bigger city, they have more resources. Of course, we don't have much of a homeless shelter here in Nevada, and so it's not difficult to see why our hospital would not want to put a strain on our local resources. With a couple of patients there who weren't even necessarily Nevada residents, and rather send them to these Joplin homeless shelters, which again, a bigger city, a couple of people. You would think it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume that the Joplin homeless shelters would have accommodations for these people, but apparently there was some sort of miscalculation in there. What that was is not abundantly clear at this moment, but that is the extent of the information on that we have at this point. We will continue to follow it here on GWP News. And on a
Yeah, and I
state
think
level,
just
there's been recent change, some recent legislation proposed to change some traffic laws. Jake, what do you know about that?
well, I will say that again, just kind of going back into that subject with the city of Joplin. Again, that new city ordinance that has been created is kind of the reason why they were having that issue, and so I think that kind of clarifies why the city of Joplin was not able to handle that.
Yes, I suppose it does. So, in terms of this recent legislation proposed on a state level here in Missouri to change some traffic laws, what do we know about that, Jake?
Yeah, so we've got a couple of different bills here in the state of Missouri. We've got a Senate Bill 1408, which was sponsored by Senator Jamie Berger, proposing increases to rural interstate and freeways to 75 miles per hour, which is similar to what it is in Kansas and Arkansas. And so then we also know that there is also a House Bill 2583 by Representative Bob Titus, and he calls for MoDOT to study on the 75 mile per hour limit with a report by August of 2028. So the Senate bill is about actually changing that speed limit, and the House bill is requesting for an investigation to be done once that takes into effect to see whether or not it should remain after it is passed into law. And so both bills have been introduced, and there's going to need to be more committee meetings. There needs to goes through several votes before this will actually come into fruition. But what we do know is that it could take into effect as early as the late part of the summer of this year, and so that would increase the speed limit, particularly in those rural areas on interstates, to 75 miles per hour. A lot of the supporters are in favor of this are arguing that modern cars have advanced safety technology that would help out with this increased speed, where MoDOT and other safety officials are concerned that it could increase crash severity and the number of crashes that we see on the roadways, considering that speeding is one of the biggest factors when it comes to many of these fatal crashes.
Absolutely, Jake. It's interesting that you mentioned the recent advance in cars because that certainly would seem to be what precedent would tell us. Certainly, if you ever speak to certainly parents, people a bit older than ourselves generally, that seems to be the case that the speed limits when they were young were much lower than they are now. And now cars have advanced considerably. And it would seem that our neighboring states, as you mentioned, Arkansas and Kansas, have already raised their speed limit up to 75, as Missouri is now looking at doing. So it would seem to be appropriate in light of this information. Don't see why Missouri ought to be the exception in that. Don't think that cars are any less advanced here in the state of Missouri. And of course, again, some interesting points. This was brought to our attention here by our regional Nexstar affiliate, KSN KODE, out of Joplin, Missouri. Of course, interestingly, they interviewed some people on that, captured some pretty interesting sentiment there. A fellow that they interviewed said something along the lines of, "Oh, well, it would be good, wouldn't really change a great deal because it seems like everyone is already going that speed. So now it would be good if the law would reflect that." Jake, I don't know what you've seen recently. Certainly, it's important to obey the speed limit, but I certainly have noticed in that area, certainly on our interstates, people going 75, even though the speed limit is 70 anyway. What about you?
I certainly have, and I know that the funny thing about that is I've seen people that have really already been going 75, 80, sometimes even 85 miles per hour. And but the only thing I will say is that the average speed, at least that I've seen on roads in Kansas, where it is 75, I would say the average speed is between 78 and 82 miles per hour on Kansas roads, just based on my observations personally. And I've driven a decent amount on Kansas roads, particularly in eastern Kansas.
Uh-huh. And just to push back on this, for any of those who may be skeptical, one reason that they might have, certainly one thing that sets apart our state from Arkansas, certainly Kansas, is that they do have higher taxes that go to road improvement and different things like that. So one could argue that because more is put into the improvement of roads in the state of Kansas, certainly, Jake, I live right here on the state line, and the roads get noticeably smoother when you enter into Kansas. So certainly not difficult to tell on that front. So one, I suppose, could make that argument that our roads just aren't in that condition. But I wouldn't say overall that that would be a terribly consequential difference. And it isn't night and day. It's not as if you're jolted or suddenly get whiplash when you enter onto a Missouri interstate. So, Jake, anything
Yeah.
else you might add on that?
Well, I will say in the northern plains, there are a few highways where it's 85 and some where it's even no speed limit already. And so that is quite interesting that you mentioned that. Something else is that Hawaii has the lowest speed limit out of any state, 60 miles per hour. So that's pretty on the low end.
Well, that's all for recent events. Up next is weather. So, moving on to weather. Jake, what is the weather forecast looking like for the week ahead?
So this week, things are going to be kind of up and down when it comes to our temperatures. We've been staying mostly above average with limited precipitation so far in 2026. Of course, we did have some severe thunderstorms back on this past Thursday, even the issuance of a tornado warning just north of the city of Joplin in and around Carthage. No tornadoes were reported out of that, but we did get some strong wind gusts in the area. And so since then, luckily, there's not going to be any severe thunderstorms as we go through this week, really nationwide. And so that'll certainly be some good news here. In fact, as we look overall on a national perspective, looking at the Storm Prediction Center's watches and warnings and advisories, you'll notice that not a whole lot of weather alerts across the country right now. We have some freeze alerts across Florida and Georgia and frost alerts there, a couple of flood warnings across Louisiana and Mississippi. Across the northern half of the region, or northern half of the country, excuse me, we have, of course, these air quality alerts that are in effect. We've got high wind warnings across Montana, as well as some winter weather ongoing, but the winter weather has stayed pretty far to the north for this time of year across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and also into New York. Um, Taking a closer look at that fire concern that we have across the state of Montana. Of course, we've got those high wind warnings, as you can see here from the National Weather Service office in Great Falls, Montana. And that National Weather Service office is showing us these high wind warnings that are in effect, including places like Great Falls. And so if we look here at the actual statement from that National Weather Service, showing that we could be looking at winds of 30 to 40 miles per hour, gust up to 65 miles per hour. So not only could we be looking at damage, like tree damage, we could also be dealing with some power outages. But the biggest concern is that because of those strong winds coupled with the warmer temperatures and low humidity, that could give us the risk for fires moving forward. In fact, as we see here, there is even an elevated fire outlook issued by the Storm Prediction Center across Wyoming and Montana, showing the possibility of the development and spread across wildfires in and across the area. And then, of course, we mentioned that winter weather advisory, excuse me, across upstate New York around the Watertown area. We could be looking at 4 to 7 inches of lake effect snow. So that's kind of the current weather that we're watching as of right now across the country.
Absolutely. And of course, in terms of winter weather, you just mentioned there, of course, upstate New York experiencing some winter weather. And of course, we know throughout the winter up to this point, we've seen above average temperatures. As you mentioned, of course, very unfortunate. No White Christmas for us here in Southwest Missouri, largely speaking. Though you mentioned we are headed for a little bit of a cool down, aren't we?
Yes, we are. And so that's what we're looking at right now. But things are going to change quite a bit as we move forward in time. And so this is the latest run. This is the GFS model. And this today brought to you by Tropical Tidbits, or at least that's where we're getting this information from. Levi Cohen is the creator of this website. Anybody can use it. Again, that is at tropicaltidbits.com if you want to find this information. But we'll look at this here, the GFS model from Tropical Tidbits. Again, you can see that we're going to be experiencing some rain showers in and across the state of Missouri Tuesday into Wednesday. And then that's going to bring in some colder temperatures. So cold front's going to come in with that chance for rain. colder temperatures as we go into Thursday and Friday. And as you'll see by the end of the week and into the weekend, we could even be dealing with the possibility of some snow, particularly to the north across Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin. So winter, you could say, is going to be making a bit of a comeback as we go into the next few days.
Absolutely. Maybe nice to see some actual wintry weather for a change. And Jake, you mentioned even as soon as this week, it is really supposed to cool down considerably, very nippy. You mentioned at some point, even potentially getting down into single digit temperatures, huh?
Yes, that is a possibility here, and I'll show you that in a moment. But here is that precipitation you can see on Saturday and Sunday. Here is midnight on Sunday morning. So this is still several days out. So, of course, there will be some changes to this forecast. It's possible that the snow doesn't even develop across the state of Missouri, but snowfall somewhere across this region is definitely a possibility, maybe even here into southwestern Missouri. That would give us our first measurable snow since that snow event that we had back on December 1st.
Absolutely. So great information there. Of course, a major cool down this coming week. So, again, if you're going out, it'll be important to bundle up for that. Jake, any other recent things or important things coming up here in terms of weather, what to expect in the coming week? What else should we know?
So I mentioned that temperature drop. Of course, this past weekend we had temperatures that were a bit more seasonable. Then we got definitely pretty warm today and tomorrow. We could even be looking at temperatures in the 60s for us across the state of Missouri. Again, by Wednesday and Thursday, big cool down expected. You can see these blues and purples indicate 5 to 10, maybe even upwards of 15 degrees below average as we go into Thursday. And then it warms up briefly on Friday. So Friday could be a little bit closer to average, but then Friday and Saturday, an even bigger blast of colder air is going to move in, and that could bring temperatures even upwards to 20 degrees below what they normally are for this time of year, which means, as indicated here, once again by the GFS model, temperatures could be in the single digits by Sunday morning. This is Sunday morning at 6 a.m. Temperatures in the single digits, potentially only rising into the teens and low 20s for Sunday afternoon. So, of course, that would be a major cool down in comparison to where we are at this point in the, or at least what we've seen so far this winter.
Oh, wow. So important to watch for, certainly. Going out this coming week, want to bundle up sufficiently. Stay warm out there. Anything
Something else
else in
is
terms of weather coming up this week, Jake?
Yeah, something else is that colder temperatures could even bring some snow across places that maybe don't see it as much. Of course, this time last year, we had a blizzard across the Gulf Coast with double-digit snowfall across the Florida Panhandle. New Orleans had its snowiest data on record with about 8 inches, but this year certainly a lot different. But we could see a little bit of snow across the South, including states like Arkansas, Mississippi, maybe even into the Alabama and into the northern Georgia mountains going into this weekend. So not only a big drop in temperatures, but also the chances for snow a little bit further to the south compared to where we've seen it recently.
Yes, now that you mention that, I certainly recall that in the past year, talking about how it was very unusual. I believe, Jake, uh, you may recall this as well. Of course, we covered. I think it was one of our episodes, one of the ones. Yes, the episode that we shot outside. I believe we talked about that. That was just after this recent, well, at the time, recent snowstorm there in New Orleans, which was very unusual again for that area.
Yeah, and it was something else that we covered in our grand 50th episode when we recapped everything in 2025. And so now, as we look at overall, now I want to compare something that's changed in 2026. We mentioned the fact that we would start using an AI model, or that an AI model did start to exist. And so I want to show you the temperature trends as far as like whether or not it's above average in the red and then below average in the blue. And I want to show you that. I want to compare compare the GFS model compared to the AI GFS model, because it's quite interesting just how different the AI GFS model is. And so, of course, we talked about that cool down later this week and also into the weekend, but I want to show you something that's quite interesting. This is on Friday, January 23rd, and I don't necessarily want to show you this because of the forecast. I want to show you the difference in the forecast between the two different models. So, of course, now that we're talking over 10 days out, this is not super accurate, but what is interesting is to see the comparison between the two different models. And so you'll notice there's quite a bit of a difference, particularly towards the end, where January 28th, it shows above average temperatures across everywhere but the southeastern US. But the AI GFS model shows much colder temperatures across the center of the country and warm temperatures in the southeastern US. And so if we compare the GFS and the AI GFS model, certainly quite a big difference from what these models are saying. And so that shows us, just kind of gives us an inside look at how that AI model has been doing in its early stages.
Absolutely. So, some important distinctions to note there between this map and the new AI model. Of course, that is new. So, it's necessary, as with many things in AI. And speaking of new technologies, largely, of course, many of these can be great tools, but it's important, of course, when adopting them, when embracing them, to do so again with a healthy bit of skepticism. Make sure they're actually accurate, that the information is correct, that again, that they're doing what they're intended to do. Jake?
Yes, and so now we'll kind of wrap up this today's weekly weather report by looking at some of those temperature outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center. Of course, the eastern half of the country. This is going from the 18th through the 22nd of January. We're expecting temperatures to be below average. That includes us here in Missouri. Temperatures to remain above average across the western half of the country. But the unfortunate news is that that precipitation outlook from the 6 to 10 day precipitation outlook is expecting us to stay a little bit below average when it comes to precipitation amounts. Now we'll look at that 8 to 14 day outlook also from the Climate Prediction Center from NOAA. And you'll notice that warmer temperatures return across Missouri and also across the western part of the U.S., with that colder air staying locked up across the Great Lakes and the Northeast, again with those below average temperatures forecasted. But the good news is that above average precipitation is set to return between January 20th through the 26th, potentially giving us additional chances for wintry weather as we go towards the end of the month.
Absolutely. So, some great information there as we proceed through the winter season. You'll want to stay tuned throughout the winter, certainly, for severe weather, things like that coming your way. Want to keep updated and informed. Your home for that is here on GWP News, certainly, among other things. Jake?
Yeah, the last thing that we'll look at is those hazardous outlooks. Again, this is an experimental project that is being done by the Climate Prediction Center, released earlier today, showing in the long range that we could be dealing with the potential for some dangerously cold temperatures, or at least hazardous temperatures overall across the Great Lakes. So we mentioned how temperatures about a week out from now would most likely stay locked up to the north, those colder temperatures. Well, it even could bring a slight risk for it to even become hazardous. As far as the hazardous precipitation outlook, across Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee and Georgia are the states that are included in that. Snowfall, especially across the Great Lakes, would not be surprised next week, considering that we have minimal ice coverage across the Great Lakes. Would not be surprised if we had a big lake effect snow event take place. And then, of course, finally, looking at the wind outlook, there are no areas that are highlighted when it comes to that risk for high winds on the experimental data from the Climate Prediction Center.
Absolutely. So, no risk of high winds. Of course, as you mentioned, we are heading into a bit colder temperatures. So, stay warm out there, certainly. And as we mentioned, all throughout the winter for severe weather, any of that, you'll want to stay tuned to GWP News. That covers weather. Up next is sports. Moving on to sports, Jake, in terms of recent sporting events, a lot of recent things. It's my understanding there's been some recent drama over the NFL wild card. What do we know about that?
Yeah, so of course, this is NFL Wild Card Weekend where the NFL playoffs have started. They will be concluding tonight with the Monday night game on ESPN, so you can find that again on ESPN. It'll be the Houston Texans facing off against the Pittsburgh Steelers. They're in Pittsburgh. Of course, the Steelers don't have as good of a record as the Texans, but did win the division, and so that is the reason why they are hosting that game. And once the conclusion of that game takes place, we will know the location, the timing, and the matchups and the TV and all of that will be announced later tonight. But as of right now, we don't necessarily know when those divisional games are going to be taking place next week. What we do know about next week's schedule is that there's going to be two games on Saturday and then two games on Sunday. The two different games are going to be the 49ers and the Seahawks, and then the Bills and the Broncos. And then, of course, on Sunday, we will have the winner of tonight's game facing off against New England, and then the Rams and the Bears will also face off on Sunday. The times on those games, again, we're not exactly sure as those haven't been announced, but what we do know is that there will be a game. We don't know what the game will be, but we do know that there will be a game at 2 o'clock Central Time, 3 o'clock Eastern Time on Saturday and Sunday. And then there will also be games at 5:30 Central, 6:30 Eastern on Saturday and Sunday as well. And so that's when the four divisional games will be next week.
Absolutely. So it'll be interesting to watch those, see how things shake out in terms of scoring. Certainly, coming to the end here, leading up to the Super Bowl. And Jake, it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on something. Of course, a phenomenon I'm sure you've noticed. I certainly have recently. Of course, we've mentioned very many times recently, of course, on this podcast about certainly our NFL team in this area, our beloved Kansas City Chiefs. And again, they've had a very disappointing season. Certainly, they're not in it at this point. They've been eliminated from the playoffs. Of course, just couldn't keep up with it. And to top all of that off, they're moving to Kansas. And that's how you know they've really hit rock bottom. So, in terms of that, of course, something I've noticed, of course, the past few years, this certainly this last year has been an exception, but the past few years, the Chiefs have actually performed pretty well. They've been in several Super Bowls, and certainly many people, in the case of my family, friends, certainly people in this area that didn't necessarily follow NFL or follow football all that closely before, suddenly took interest in it when the Chiefs suddenly were performing at this level. They were actually making Super Bowls, performing at this level. And now we've had these past few years of the Chiefs playing in the Super Bowls, and now they're not. Now they're out of the playoffs. But these people still want something to watch. And so even though they weren't loyal NFL viewers necessarily before, the Chiefs in our area here sort of pulled them into it. And now, even though the Chiefs have been eliminated, they're still watching NFL games. Have you noticed that at all, Jake, here in our area?
Yeah, I would say so. I think that has been the case, and of course, that there has been quite a few exciting games in the wild card round this weekend. Of course, the first four games, the winner was actually decided within the last minute of the game, and so that really shows the kind of excitement. We had two games over the weekend that both had the most lead changes in the fourth quarter, so that was quite interesting. And then something else that I found to be quite fascinating was not only the fact that the defending Super Bowl champions were taken down at home last night by the 49ers, the final score, of course, being 23-19, San Francisco winning that game. But I also thought it was interesting just the fact that there has been so many close games. But then in a game that wasn't so close last night in New England, where New England won 16-3 against the Chargers, I thought it was interesting. The Patriots fans were singing "Living on a Prayer" there at the end of the song. So I thought that was quite entertaining
Yes,
because the Chargers
absolutely.
were
Very
living
interesting.
on a
It's
prayer at
always
that point in time.
interesting to see those very passionate fans getting involved at the games. And of course, it is interesting that you mentioned that. We certainly seem to have seen that. Even outside of the Chiefs, there seems to have been a recent shakeup in terms of standings in the NFL year on year, hasn't there?
Yes, yeah, certainly so. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, of course, with tonight, the final wild card game, and then next Saturday and Sunday with those divisional games, of course, leading up to the AFC and NFC national champion or those divisional championship games that'll be taking place during that last weekend of January. And so with that, we move into our next sports topic. Of course, with tonight, we've got a really big college basketball game going on. So as football season starts to wind down, you can tune in tonight because we got a big matchup. We've got number 11 BYU traveling to Texas Tech, who's ranked number 15. That game is going to be streaming on the ESPN network, ESPN or ESPN2. We've also got some other games as well for Texas Tech that should be quite exciting. As somebody from Texas, I know that's who I'm going to be pulling for. Texas Tech. I hope you're able to get the victory. And as far as that ranking from the Associated Press, Arizona still continuing to stay at the top. I think it's quite interesting that, at least as of a couple of days ago when I last checked, Vanderbilt was undefeated in both men's and women's college basketball. So I found that to be quite interesting, just considering how early on we are in the season, but also how many games there have been still as well. And you can see that they are 16-0 and ranked number 10. Of course, BYU has only lost one game, ranked right below them at number 11. So some interesting news on that. Also, tomorrow we've got some really big news that's going to be coming out. The AUSL, which is now our new professional softball league, is going to be announcing the locations of where all of the different teams are going to be at. The Oklahoma City Spark, so far, is the only team that has announced the new locations of where those teams are going to be home based at, but the other five teams will be announcing their location tomorrow, with, of course, the regular season beginning this coming June. Well, that's about all of the time that we have for this evening. We're now going to finish things up with the GWP Weekly Surprise. The biggest surprise I felt from the week was the fact that the first ever Secret Trader series, The Traders, ended up being somebody who would probably be considered um, never to be a traitor, which was the mother of Travis and Jason Kelsey. Um, that is on, again, that is streaming exclusively there on Peacock. You can continue to watch The Traders, with the first few episodes were dropped last Thursday. Of course, The Secret Trader, for the first time that has ever been a thing, and so it was quite interesting.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Well, I believe that'll do it for now.